Okay, I've got 3 stories in this podcast. One is a Bigfoot encounter, the other is a paranormal encounter, and the last one is a short little campfire tale. You're gonna love it! Let's jump into it. This first one is from a woman who I think has watched my channel for several years. She's left many comments. I'm not gonna say her name, because I think she's a quiet, private person, but she's a real sweetie. She's always been real encouraging to me. And I got her story in and I'm doing it today. The main reason why I'm emailing you today is to share an encounter my dad's best childhood friend had when he was about 10 years old. My dad and his friend are both veterans and they're credible. The encounter happened in the mid-1970s in southwest Mississippi while fox hunting at night. My dad's friend passed last year in 2021 after losing a battle with cancer. My dad has also passed in September of this year, 2022, due to complications from surgery. This is the only reason why I'm writing to you about this encounter. Both of these men were outstanding people with impeccable reputations. Your channel is the only one I feel is credit worthy of sharing it. Oh, thank you. I apologize in advance for any editing you have to do. I tried my best to make it as smooth a read as possible. You did. You did a good job. My grandfather moved to southwest Mississippi in the mid-60s after retiring from carpentry. He had a great love for fox hunting, so he purchased 100 acres out in the country, away from city life and all the bustle that goes with it. After building his home and getting settled in, he purchased a few Walker foxhounds to hunt with. He had met a few people who shared in his love of the hunt, but after many failed attempts to come across a red fox in his area, he began working with the wildlife services to bring them back into the area. He didn't harvest the foxes, he just loved the races the dogs had while hunting. If the dogs happened to tree one, he or the other hunters would go to the dogs and see what kind of fox it was. Most all of them were gray foxes in the beginning, but after a few years the red foxes started making a comeback with the help of the WLNF. My dad would hunt with Pawpaw when we were there. His best friend showed interest too before long. He had a few dogs and he started to hunt when he was able. On this particular fall evening, all of the men were scattered about with several races going on. John, my father's friend, was sitting out at the end of the National Forest Road listening for the dogs. He could hear them, but they were a half-mile away. He decided to build a small fire and sit a while to see where the race ended. All the hunters had CB radios, and this is how they communicated. After getting a campfire going, he grabbed his thermos of coffee off the seat of his truck, and he sat down by the fire. While he was listening to the race and sipping coffee, he could hear the dogs getting a little closer, so his attention was mostly focused on the dogs. A couple of times his attention was diverted from the race to the woods on the opposite side of the truck. There was a rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs when all would go quiet and his attention would turn to the race. Soon the race turned and the dogs went completely out of hearing range. John could hear the squelching of the CB radio every now and then, but no one was reporting anything with their locations. Getting comfortable by the fire and returning to his coffee, the noise began again in the woods beside his truck. The only light was the campfire, and it didn't lend much to aiding visibility of his surroundings. He assumed whatever was making the noise was likely an armadillo, a possum, a raccoon, or maybe even a dog that had been separated from the pack. John walked over to his truck and retrieved his flashlight. Maybe it was a dog that was timid and wouldn't come to him, so he walked to the end of his truck and shined the flashlight to see if there was a dog standing at the tree line. He whistled a few times to see if a dog showed up. There was nothing. Nothing was there. John turned off his flashlight, went back to the campfire, and sat down once more with the thermos lid of his coffee in his hand. He had no more taken a sip when he heard the rustling of leaves and the popping of twigs and swishing of tree limbs. John stood up and was about to walk to the other side of the truck to search the tree line when a big dark figure appeared at the bed of his truck and began moving around toward him. With very little light from the fire, he thought at first maybe it was another raccoon hunter who had seen or smelled his fire. And then the figure got closer. John was about to greet the fellow and offer some coffee, but as it came into the firelight, he realized it wasn't a man. He didn't know what it was, and his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. It was huge and black as coal, and it was slowly making its way toward him. The hair raised up on his arms and the back of his neck as fear welled up inside him. This thing was no more than 12 feet away. It was then that John dropped his cup of coffee and ran to the door of his truck and threw it open and dove inside. He started up his truck, dropped it into drive, and spun dirt and gravel trying to get out of there while it stood there at the back of his truck just watching. As he drove down the curvy gravel road, he regained his composure and called the other hunters up on the CB to find the nearest one to him. He never said anything to the others. He finished the night's hunt, slept in his camper parked at my grandparents' place, and he went home the next morning as if nothing had happened. He didn't even consider going back to the location to retrieve his thermos, his flashlight, or his lawn chair. A few weeks later, he called my dad and asked him if there was anyone he knew who would be interested in his foxhounds. He had decided fox hunting wasn't for him. After chatting with my father for a while, that is when he told him of the experience that he had that night. A year or two later, Dad told me about this incident. We as kids would spend summers and school holidays at our grandparents' hunting squirrels and rabbits and quail. We also had horses, and we'd ride all over the woods from practically daylight to dark. Our grandfather would take us fox hunting on horseback as well. I'm not sure why my dad told us about Mr. John's encounter, but I'd like to think that it was to let us know what's in the woods and to always be alert and aware of our surroundings. Now that I'm an adult, I've had several conversations with Dad about Mr. John's encounter, and I asked him if he believed what he had said. Dad's answer was, "Why wouldn't I believe him? He's my lifelong best friend. He's never lied to me, nor have I lied to him." And she writes, this is for the listeners. There are many facets to the Bigfoot phenomenon. Some are curious, some are believers, and some are knowers. I am a believer, and I hope I never become a knower. I can't say with certainty that I wouldn't lose my mind if I did happen to encounter or even see one of these creatures. I do know, by this account, they do exist. You might say I'm gullible to simply believe by someone else's experience, but by me knowing what kind of man told this story, it removes all doubt for me. Oh, what? That is a fantastic story, and to the woman who sent it, you know how I feel about you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm so glad to get a story from you. That's really basically what I wanted to say. I'm not going to make any commentary on this one. Says it all. All right, let's go to the next one. This is, it's kind of short, but it's kind of a paranormal, weird, could be a Bigfoot story. The woman writes, 8 years ago, we bought a small home on a half-acre in the foothills of the West Mountains of southern Colorado. We were so thrilled to be out of the big city where we could hear the wind in the trees and see the brilliant night stars. I'd often pour a glass of wine and sit on the front deck until midnight, and sometimes I'd wander around on our property and rearrange landscape items just for the fun of it. My husband often chided me for this, saying it wasn't safe for me to be wandering around late at night alone, but I never had an ounce of fear in this place. It was the epitome of paradise to me. 3 years later, as I sat on the deck one night, marveling at the stars and the peaceful night, everything changed. I heard something. It seemed like it was a property or two over, and it sounded like the gallop of 4-footed beasts with heavy thumping feet. Within a minute, it was inside our property line, and it was headed straight for the house. The stomping was unmistakable. This was one or more big creatures, and my mind screamed, "It's the hordes from hell." It had moved around to the back of the house and was coming to the porch. Fear like I've never known filled me with terror as I scrambled to pull the storm door open and then push the main door inside and then secure them behind me. I couldn't imagine that I would escape at a rate of speed that it was coming. I just knew I'd never make it inside. But I did, somehow, and in my flurry I knocked pictures off the wall and I sent table items to the floor. My husband was in bed but scrambled at the ruckus to see what was happening. He started to open the front door to look, but in terror I demanded that he not do it. Peering out the window, he searched for the cause of my terror and never saw anything. I pleaded with him not to go searching, convinced that whatever it was would devour him, and he eventually gave in to me. The next day we ventured out and searched for signs. There were a few huge dog prints in the gravel, so we decided it had to be the neighbor's dog chasing a rabbit. But that explanation never felt right to me, even though I tried to accept it through the years. The footfalls were too heavy, and there were too many fences between properties. In addition, there was a snorting sound as this thing breathed. Plus, why would my mind suddenly call it the hordes from hell? Why was I filled with such overwhelming terror? I've never reacted to anything that way. It still makes no sense to me, and I remember the terror clearly. So, as you may have guessed, I haven't sat outside at night since then, which is sad. I really used to enjoy it. I have a suspicion about what it was after listening to your stories for a few years. Thank you, Cameron, for what you do. Keep it up. And the writer's name is Marna. And, I don't know what this was, but I think she's alluding to that maybe this thing is Bigfoot. Maybe that's what she's saying. I don't know. I've read so many different kind of stories. I'm just guessing, but most of them are Bigfoot stories. That's probably what she's talking about. All right, let's go to this campfire tale. I thought this was really fun, and we'll wind this up. Okay, this is a campfire tale, but it refers back to the tulpa, which is a Tibetan demon, the writer says. The writer's name is Mike. I just got this in yesterday, and I thought it would be a cool little short campfire story to end the podcast with. One day a man came riding along a lonely mountain trail on his way to the village in the valley below. The weather was cold and windy, and a strong gust blew his fur hat off. As it was nearing sundown, and he was in a hurry to reach home before dark, he didn't go back to look for it. Some days later, another man was traveling on the same trail when the furry object in the pathway caused his horse to shy violently, nearly throwing him off. When he got home, the man told some of his friends about the strange animal, which he couldn't identify, and he told them it spooked his horse. In the days and weeks and months that followed, other people began to report the presence of an unknown creature, which sometimes lurks in the bushes near the trail, or at other times it would dart across in front of them. After a while, it began to grow larger and pursue travelers. Occasionally, a person would fall to his death while trying to outrun it. And as time went by, it continued to grow even larger and began to show an ugly set of fangs. It snapped at its victims and snarling and growling fiercely. People were so terrified that they stopped using that trail, and it became overgrown with brush and trees. An aura of darkness and evil began to seep in from the mountain like a poisonous fog, creeping at last down into the village. No one would dare to venture out after nightfall, but at times someone would vanish mysteriously, even in broad daylight, as the monster claimed another victim. Eventually, the village was abandoned, and the people moved far away and they never returned. They took with them their memories and lore, warning everyone that they met of the accursed mountain and the unknown horror that lurks there even to this day. And so, my friends, if ever you are riding alone on a lonely mountain trail and your hat blows off, or your weave, your wig, toupee, or other hairpiece, you better go back and retrieve it. Pick up those weaves and wigs and toupees and fur hats, because they could turn into monsters. He finishes with, this was a favorite campfire tale when I was a kid. It's a retelling of an old Tibetan parable about the consequences of misperception. A tulpa is a demonic entity. Besides Mike, I thought that was a fun story. So I don't know how long this podcast is going to be, 15, 20 minutes. But I had a few times. I'm working on Steve Lilly right now. And I just love putting these podcasts out. So I took a couple hours off, did this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks.